Earlier, I said that in the Hebrew Bible, there are two foundational stories, the story of creation and the story of the Exodus. And thus, one of the two foundational stories is an explicit story about God bringing freedom to slaves. But what about the other story? Does the story of creation have any link to slavery? In 586 BC, Jerusalem and the kingdom of Judah were completely destroyed by the Babylonians. Many of the inhabitants of Judah were killed, and many of the survivors were taken back to Babylon to serve as slaves. Babylon had its own religious landscape. They were polytheists who believed in a pantheon of gods. Chief among them was Marduk. They also had their own creation story written on a series of clay tablets. It's called the Enuma Elish. In the Enuma Elish, the universe was created during a great battle of the gods. Marduk ended up killing his mother, Tiamat, the goddess of the salt seas. After killing her, he ripped her apart, and from her innards, Marduk fashioned the cosmos. Thus, for Babylonians, creation was an act of violence where the primordial waters were ripped apart. Some biblical scholars believe that the creation story that we find in the first chapter of Genesis was written while the Israelites were captive in Babylon. And they think that some of the details in Genesis 1 were written to directly refute the Babylonian story of creation. In other words, while the Israelites were in Babylon and hearing the creation story of the Babylonian religion, they were reflecting on their own faith. And when they put their faith side by side with the Babylonians, they saw an opportunity to say no. Notice that when God creates the universe in Genesis 1, he too splits the primordial waters on the second day of creation. In Genesis 1, he takes the waters and separates them to make the waters above and the waters below. On the third day of creation, he takes the waters below and separates them out from the dry land. In Genesis, God creates by separating water. But it is absolutely, positively not an act of violence. It's an act of creativity. And he doesn't even use his hands. He speaks, and it happens. It's the opposite of the Babylonian Enuma Elish. In the Babylonian creation myth, humanity is created out of the blood of another murdered god named Kingo. And the humans were made out of Kingo's remains to specifically serve the gods as slaves. In the Enuma Elish, that was our purpose, our sole purpose, the reason for our creation. We were slaves of the gods, which is interesting given that we've already seen the Old Testament call the people of God, and even Moses, slaves of God. But in Genesis 1, humanity isn't created to be slaves, but rather humanity is created in the image of God. Yes, to serve God, but also to tend the earth, to procreate, and to fill the earth with other humans who would bear the image of God. In the ancient world, Babylon, Egypt, Persia, Assyria, the image of a god was the role of a priest. In Genesis, it is the role of every single human being who has ever lived. The scholars who think Genesis 1 was written in Babylon to directly challenge the Babylonian religion wonder if God creating us in God's own image is a way to challenge the Babylonian understanding of being slaves for the gods. We are not slaves of murderous, tyrannical gods who rip each other apart. Yes, God does call us to servanthood. slavery even, but it is a slavery that brings with it the divine imprint. We bear our master's image. We bear the image of God, who creates, who speaks things into being, and who is the embodiment of justice, love, and peace.